All right, we're going to get started. Thank you for your patience, everyone. People are on their way, but we've waited as long as we can, and appreciate your patience. And I'm going to say a couple of introductory things before I bring up our two really excellent guest speakers, and then we'll have ample time to do some Q&A with both of them together afterwards. And we'll put some chairs up here and sit and chill in a circle, grounded style. So it's really nice to have you here. It's a beautiful day out, and you chose to be with us, and we appreciate that. And I do want to say this is some of my students are here as a class, Race and Ethnicity out of Kennesaw. Some of you came in for the Walter Rodney Speaker Series, and it's meshed together very strategically in our purpose. And I know you travel from great distance, and that's pretty cool. We'll talk more about that. But so it's nice to have you here. And our guest speakers just flew in today from a great distance. They briefed today, but I wanted to say that this was the 7th annual Walter Rodney Speaker Series, and this is the final session of the 7th annual. So we've been doing this now for 7 years, so it's a symbolic number, and it's a historic accomplishment, and a lot of people worked with me to make it happen, so I wanted to mark that particular event. I did want to also say that, and I don't know if I said this in front of my class before, but I actually am the sitting teacher of the year at Kennesaw State University for the whole university, and a lot of the reason for that is the teaching innovation that this class represents, and I wrote it up in my papers when they nominated me for that award. So it's a big honor on that campus, and I don't like to talk about it publicly, but it felt appropriate to recognize that this is a pedagogic space, a teaching space that has been carefully crafted. And I do a lot of creative work in my race and ethnicity class, and I do a lot of guest speakers there as well. But I did copy, I was telling Peter Reinbach about this, Vincent Harding was here in 2012 at Morehouse and did an incredible class on the civil rights movement, and he brought in guest speakers, and it was open to his students, to any student in the whole city, and then also to the public. And so I went to some of the classes, and he had the most amazing guest speakers. I met Grace Boggs for the first time in my life in his classroom. And seeing his model inspired me to do this, which was to combine different levels, PhD and undergrad, sometimes high school students, to combine current students, former students, to have friends and guests, friends like Al Josie is arriving, elders and leaders from our community who are interested in this kind of work and to create a community space. I also have interesting things to say. And so there's also a gift of the there. So this idea of creating a public space to share ideas, to learn together, and then the concept of groundings, which I know John was going to talk more about, and we talk about a lot in our books and in our journals and the work we do. But creating a space where we can all talk and reason together is a unique Rodney legacy. So that's why we do this work. It's one of the main things we do out of it. I'm just coming off of a book tour myself, where I went around with some of the Rodney books. I wanted to show you those briefly, and after the class we can share some of them and sell some of them. But the Russian Revolution came out and then another book, their entire Black Radical price until April 30th. So I'm able to announce that. If you're interested in these books, it's a great time to buy. They're well priced every day, and they're half price. And normally Amazon sells pricing, so they're pretty cheap on Amazon right now. And there are some copies here. And then most pricing is extremely important because it's just red top the press copy if you buy it forward. Honestly, I'm a huge fan of Peter Weinbach. I just got to meet Peter today, and it's been awesome. Part of the reason I do this work is so I get to pick up really cool people from the airport to hang out with them because I've been reading their work for 10, 20, 30 years, whatever it is. I read, and you shall make a note of this essay, All the Atlantic Mountains Shook. Anybody here ever heard of it or read it? In grad school, and we were reading everything, all the critical theory. Ever since I read that, Dr. Linebaugh here became one of those handful of people that some of the stuff is easy, but a lot of it's in a way I never understood it before. I knew it was a complex place. I knew it'd been complex for a long time, but the New York that shows up in here in the 1700s is a more representative, a cooler New York than I ever knew existed. So it's inspired. And I was going to say I wrote a couple notes, but I was just going to say history is inherently a projection back of what we're thinking in the present. And it's really hard for any historian or any reader to open their minds to alternative histories because we're so rooted in assumptions in the present that we realize they're assumptions, because that's what they are, they're assumptions. And Peter Linebaugh has a rare creativity in opening our conceptions of what's possible, conceptions of possible pasts. And by doing that, new conceptions of possible presents and futures. When you read his works, sometimes it feels like poetry, sometimes it feels like revolution in motion. Sometimes it feels like a raw hallucination. You're like, what is this? I don't even understand what's going on around me as I'm reading this. And it's histories. Half of it is like texts and words that were already said by other people that he's excavated. But it doesn't make sense sometimes because it's so far beyond those unexamined assumptions that we didn't know we took for granted until we came to his text. So it's a text that can wake you up and shake you loose from these unrealized assumptions. It helps us return to a creativity and build new histories, which allow us to build new futures. So those are my thoughts and my meditations as I was getting ready for this last night. I was sort of staying up late, going through some of my favorite texts, and just trying to think what this visit meant for me. So I wanted to share that with you. I didn't do the traditional introduction where I go through the biography because Peter Linebaugh has a lot of essays and all this, and you're all resourceful and have a supercomputer in your hand these days, right? So you can look it all up. You don't have to run to a library. So you should Google him, Amazon him, check him out. He writes in Counterpunch. He just told me he has an essay coming out tomorrow. And we shared on our social media an essay on 1968 he wrote that features Walter Rodney and Grace Boggs as a way to understand 1968. So that's another suggested piece. It's on our social media if you go to Walter Rodney Speaker Series or Walter Rodney Foundation. I put it in both places. And so you should be able to find it there. You can always just message me. But that piece on 1968 came out last year, and it's with Boston Review. And it's a great example of his writing and his style. So with that said, please let's give a warm welcome to Peter Linebaugh.
Well, thank you very much, Jesse. It's a real honor to be here. As he said, I'm from up north, from Ann Arbor, Michigan, and I haven't ever in my life been to Atlanta or to Georgia before. I might have been to one conference once, but it was like in a hotel, so it could have been anywhere. But it's especially important for me to be here because as a center of the American freedom struggle, Atlanta, in my understanding, and our presence here tonight, links to the Caribbean, and links to Africa, and links to a Pan-African or This is why Atlanta is, and this occasion is important to me. It's also important because I am here with the Walter Rodney public lecture. Walter Rodney And the revolutionary means that this world need not be the same. It need not continue in the same way. And in fact, what we have now was once only a dream. So Rodney sought to put into motion revolutionary ideas at an important time in history. And that time was the freedom struggle of colonies against several European empires. So where those empires had several weapons, among the most pernicious and powerful was their doctrine of white supremacy. What this means is that he was a man of study. He would study the works of Karl Marx, and he would study how they related to the world around him. This he saw from his own experience in life, as he learned with Karl Marx, is a class struggle, that the world consists of the rich and the poor. And the wealth of nations is dependent upon the impoverishment of people. And that is a relationship that Rodney studied carefully with the tools, the materialist tools of economics, sociology, politics, and always putting this in the context of what people were actually doing. And as he was coming up, from Fidel Castro to Mao Zedong, in Africa, freedom fighters were fighting, as I said, against European imperialism. To do this, he had to combat Stalinism. He had to enter into the ideological struggles of the Cold War, which in simplicity put communism against capitalism. Rodney, to his dying day, was anti-capitalist, as I understand it. Rodney had a conception of humanity which you need. And this is why, with all the seriousness at our command, we ask you to study Rodney, to read his books, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. When the ruling class will teach you that Africa was always underdeveloped and that the imperialist countries would develop it. Rodney turned that upside down. This ability to turn things upside down is the source of his radicalism, to be as radical as reality. To be effective, he needs to combat the ruling ideology or the ruling ideas. This is why, at the highest level of human understanding, he placed his scholarship at our service. And so his book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, is a treasure for humankind. His lectures on the Russian Revolution were given in Dar es Salaam in 1970-71. It has a splendid introduction by Robin D.G. Kelly and my colleague, Jesse Benjamin. Its footnotes help to bring it up to date. Rodney was a skilled historian, a skilled scholar of the Russian Revolution. Why is that revolution important? For two reasons. First, it's the first time that a working class, peasants, factory workers, soldiers, and sailors seized state power, just as surely as John Brown at Harper's Ferry sought to seize state power for the sake of the abolition of slavery, commencing a struggle that lasted a few short years to 1865. The Russian Revolution is a continuation of that. It is a continuation also of the French Revolution of 1789. What we are learning recently, thanks to the work of Julius Scott and his dissertation, speaking to the young scholars in the room, his dissertation remained an underground classic for years, because what he did is that he showed behind the French Revolution was the suffering masses of the Caribbean that had produced the wealth of Europe. I'm speaking of the drug trade, don't you know? Refined sugar, the sugar plantation. That sugar has no nutritional value, and yet I can speak from experience. I'm not in the 12-step group or sugar, but I've got to stay away. Sugar in milk or the sugar in fruit. Exploitation of massive numbers of people who had been exiled from their land in their communal passage. Oh, that's a stupid word. Erase that. The middle passage. There's nothing famous about it. It's an infamous crime for humanity. Behind the French Revolution is the Haitian Revolution that commenced in August 1791 and reached a conclusion with the independence of Haiti in 1804. Okay, I've got to back off now and decide to myself what it is I'm doing. You're keeping time, I hope.
Sure, you have lots of it.
So we have the importance of Rodney's looking in Dar es Salaam and teaching in Dar es Salaam on the Russian Revolution is that he wanted to explore what can we do as free countries? What can we do in Africa that is not to develop capitalism, not to develop a system based on the monetary exploitation of a proletariat. Proletariat means those who are good for nothing except producing children, women. That's the Roman definition of the proletariat. As time goes by, it's going to include men. Men and women who are excluded from the means of subsistence, the means of life, the means of enjoyment, the means of production. The Russian Revolution is a time when such a proletariat state power. And Rodney wants to go back and see, how did the Russian Revolution fail? What happened that caused it to fail? He looked into history to see whether there was anything that would help mankind, including women, in the future. That's the importance of history and the importance to Rodney's. And what Rodney did was he investigated the scholarship at the highest levels in England, in the United States, in France, on the Russian Revolution. Most of that scholarship was deeply anti-socialist. Most of that scholarship was profoundly pro-capitalist. And yet, Rodney, with his skills, went through it to see what could learn. He did this in 1970 and 71. I'd like to say that you should know something about me. I fell in love with the Communist Manifesto as a boy when I was at the headquarters of the U.S. Army in Frankfurt, Germany in 1956. I was just recently in Hawaii where everybody was talking, the kids were talking about what my privileges were, what my ethnicity was. And they said, what is it to be a white man? And I said, don't look at me as a white man. You look at me as an imperialist. Because I come from the U.S. empire. My privileges derive from the U.S. empire. My parents were diplomats representing the United States to other countries. That's one of the jobs of the diplomat. And so I grew up in London, in Karachi, Pakistan, in Bonn, Germany. I quickly sought to overthrow it, as a childhood rebellion, and that's how I found the Communist Manifesto, and I've been on that path ever since. So just to let you know a little bit about myself. But I've seen Marxists in the academy who are phonies, and I didn't know how to deal with them. And this was in Rochester, New York. And on the 12th of December, 1978, I left those phonies. Christopher Lasch, Eugene Genovese, Stanley Engerman, I can name them, that's no problem there. And we can talk about it if we want to get sectarian, but I don't. But I left on a cold night to attend an 8 o'clock lecture by a slender young man named Walter Rodney, who was lecturing at the university at Brockport, New York. And I sat in the back because I was unsure. But I'd already known that here was a man whose experience in life showed his integrity. Where he put his body in the world struggle, from Jamaica to Montreal and then to Africa, spoke for itself. He didn't need to prove anything. But I wanted to hear what he had to say. That's why I went to hear him. I'm not a Rodney specialist at all. And many of his another personal thing. A woman gave me a first edition of How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. She found it in a used bookstore on the East End of London, in the docks of London. And she got it, and she gave it to me. And her name is Michaela Brennan, and it was better than a Valentine's card. And we now are married. This was how she could get to my heart, through Rodney. You see, because here was a Marxist intellectual and activist of incomparable. Well, no, it's not incomparable. Because in 1970, I shook the dust from my feet from this God-forsaken imperialist land and busy killing Vietnamese peasants and workers. And I fled to England to study with another revolutionary who the London Times called the greatest communist that England ever produced. He was also an historian. And his name was E.P. Thompson. And he had written a book called The Making of the English Working Class back in 1963. And that was the year when Frantz Fanon's book, The Wretched of the Earth, appeared for the first time in English. That was the year that Rachel Carson published Silent Spring and showed how the planet was becoming poisoned. That was the year that James Baldwin wrote The Fire Next Time, a manifesto, a j'accuse against the white ruling structures of the United States. So it was an important year that this Making of the English Working Class appeared by an English communist who left the Communist Party, but had remained a very creative Marxist analyst of class relations. Except, as the Irish say, English history happens elsewhere. You follow me? English history, the wealth of England, those super chaps, comes from, as I said to the beginning, from the exploitation and expropriation, the oppression of masses of people, laborers, workers, housewives, trying of the world, of the global South, but especially black and brown people of the world. So I thought, because I used to listen to Malcolm X on the radio, and because I had heard about Walter Rodney, that I was going to teach Edward. You know how students are with their mentors. You know, in other words, I could convey to him some of the experience of the freedom struggle. He could convey to me some of the experience and knowledge which he had of the English working class. So you will see, who's seen the movie Peterloo? I haven't seen it yet either. I can't wait to see it. It's a big massacre that took place in England and Manchester in 1819, just at approximate time of Denmark Vesey's rising in Carolina, South Carolina, don't you know? So what the Haitian Revolution causes us to think about, that the Russian Revolution does not, is how at a time of the creation of the doctrine of white supremacy, at a time when more slave ships embarked from English ports than ever before in history. Oh, I forgot where that sentence started. See, here's where I need Rodney. I should write this stuff out. I should write it out. Don't you know? I was talking about Peterloo, wasn't I? That's the English working class in motion, being formed at the time that capitalism is making machines exploit people even more intensely, like, you know, the cotton gin in Georgia. Like you might know the steam engine. You've heard of that. Fukushima is a steam engine based on atomic power. But back at the time of the Haitian Revolution, the steam engine was based on coal. I'm so happy that while I've been speaking, I haven't heard one sneeze or one cough or one clearing of the throat. I think the lungs must be, and the air must be relatively healthy here. But for much of the planet, we are now suffering from the global warming that derives from the coal and the CO2 that went into the stratosphere, that came from the lithosphere, or the underground, burned on our level, and then went into the sky. This happened in 1800. This happened at the time, you see, of the Haitian Revolution. This new combination, a global combination of the cotton gin and the steam engine, produces a cotton plantation and a factory. One on one side of the Atlantic, the other on the other. One predominantly African American, the other predominantly, I was going to say Anglo, but that's not true, is it? The people who went into the factories were not Anglo particularly. What were they? Irish. Irish. Trouble in Ireland is going to mean exile, leaving, immigration to the factory. So at the time of Haitian independence, the world is being reorganized. Do you see? Yes. Yeah. And we are now suffering the consequences. Not only in the development of the racist society, but there are two other big structures that I need to remind you of. We dug a plantation. We did the factory somewhat. All of this is at about 1800, about 170 years ago, or I can't do the math, 1800.
220.
What?
220.
220, thank you very much. The two other structures I want you to know about before I introduce the heroine of my story. We have slavery, Middle Passage. Now we have the enclosure movement. The lands of England, of Ireland, of Scotland, and soon the whole world is going to be and is privatized. That is, the open field agriculture, the basis of common life and common communities, is now being privatized, which simply means fences are put up, hedges are grown, and most important, signs are put up saying keep off or no trespassing. But I've learned that you have been taught Woody Guthrie's great song, "This Land Is Your Land," and in that song, you know, he says the no trespassing sign is on one side, but on the other side is nothing.
I leave that part out.
So that's our job, is to fill in that other side. In other words, what is our future to be? Are we going to restore some kind of common life that is not dependent on the enclosure of private property? See, now I'm getting to communism. Do you follow me? Communism, as you Christians will learn from the book of Acts or from the Psalms, is sharing the earth. The earth is the possession of all. It's not the possession of a few in their towers or their, quote, development, but of all. This enclosure movement, more parliamentary acts of enclosure were passed in 1800 than any other time in history. So these two movements, the slave trade, the enclosure movement, happen at the same time for the purpose of maximizing exploitation, of increasing the rate of surplus value. The earth is turned into a commodity, is turned into real estate. It is no longer a sacred place. It is no longer Gaia. It is no longer Mother Earth. It is no longer a place where you can just erect a tent. It's no longer a place where you can live. It's no longer a place where you can hunt or fish or farm or do a garden unless you own the land. This is privatization. Now the third structure, so we have slavery, enclosure, and the third structure is the penitentiary. Mass incarceration is as necessary to capitalism as is the factory or the plantation. It is the place of maximum enclosure. It is the place of total absence of freedom. And the first penitentiary was erected in Philadelphia in 1791, the Walnut Street Jail, where the purpose of that penitentiary is to make people work. And on the time that George Washington was inaugurated, 15 people escaped. Let freedom ring. That's what I'm saying. There was a prisoner movement in that decade of the 1790s. You could be put in prison for debt. So a regime of imprisonment, a regime of the factory, a regime of the plantation is in place at this time when the masses of people in Haiti rise up. This is what I'm teaching. And what does this have to do with Walter Rodney? Well, I said at the beginning, two things about Rodney, is he had a broad view. He was willing to think about humanity as a whole, especially African people or African people as a whole. But I wanted to read just the conclusion, because I wanted you to hear a particular phrase. Essentially, what we need to do is to define our own stand first and see where it coincides. Because he had asked, where do we stand? Assuming a view springing from some socialist variant, not necessarily Marxist, but anti-capitalist, assuming a view that is at least radical humanist, then the Soviet Revolution of 1917 and the subsequent construction of socialism emerges as a very positive historical experience from which we ourselves can derive a great deal as we move to confront similar problems. So this is why he studied the Russian Revolution and why we should too. But what I wanted you to hear, and what stood out for me is that phrase, radical humanist. Because in the revolutionary tradition, oh, this is mine, of the, no, I brought it with me. I'm hoping Jesse will do me the honor of signing it before we're done. Where was I? Yeah, forgive me, I'm a bit tired, and I do worry about Alzheimer's and things like that. At my age, you can't help but worry about it. You know, every time I forget something, I wonder, oh, am I being stuck? But thank you for your help. You know, I couldn't think without you. Radical humanism is the phrase of that man, E.P. Thompson, who I mentioned earlier as the making of the English working class. Because that English working class, you see, was formed at the time of the Haitian Revolution, of the Haitian struggle. Okay, so radical humanist, that was the phrase against the rigors of Stalinism back at that time. This had a controversial history. So I was very happy and surprised to read it at the conclusion of Rodney's lecture. Because Rodney's by no means, well, I don't need to speak more about him, there are others in the room who will know more. What I do want to speak about, I better check my notes. Oh, yeah. How did Rodney approach property? That's what I was thinking. That's why I was so interested in history as a weapon in the struggle. One of his essays in Groundings with My Brothers. Because he has a view of Africa that where African society and life is based on hospitality. It's based on learning. And it's based on custom, not law. And these three characteristics may be found in other civilizations around the world. Hospitality, learning, perpetual growth, and custom, or not going to law. These are characteristics that I found, and I find them in wherever human beings live in mutuality with the means of production and the means of subsistence, production and reproduction. And this, in general, I call the commons. The two exponents of the commons that I have studied, I wrote on the board, but it's far away and the ink is dim. And I look around the room and I despair. Among the students, you should write this down because you will forget. Writing is one of the oldest tools humans have for the aid to memory. It gives us access to all the wisdom of the past and gives us access to the world. But I, on the other hand, am behind you because you have the internet, you have software, and you know how to do that. So I'm not going to scold you. You can see I love books. You can see I love writing. And I don't want you to forget Catherine. I don't want you to forget Colonel Edward Marcus Despard. And I don't want you to forget Catherine Despard. And if I can put their names into your head so that they stay for a short while, I will feel that my trip has been more than worth it. Because Colonel Edward Marcus Despard was Irish, and he worked for the British Empire, and he went on to Jamaica and sighted the artillery at outside of Kingston. And elsewhere, he was there for several years, right after Patsy's revolt. This was an Irishman working for the British Empire. Do you see how the British Empire will take people from one colony and use them against another colony? Ireland is the oldest colony of the English Empire. It's in. But he changed his mind. Remember, Rodney asked, where do we stand? If you grow, you can always change where you stand. You might start out as a white supremacist capitalist pig, but you could learn. And it doesn't have to be violent or mean. You can always learn. And human beings, we have the capacity of changing. Isn't this amazing? And it never ends. So I did want to say that right away. But now, I haven't lost the thread. No. He changed. He met Catherine Despard. He met an African-American woman, a Creole. I'm not sure where. They may have met in Jamaica, most likely. Those imperialists, they would always get an African-American woman to do their laundry, to do their cooking, to look after them when a bit of malaria hit. But unlike the others, he married her and brought her back to England. And this scholarship teaches us, and generations of study of Caribbean, African-American historians, was quite rare. So by the 1790s, this pair in London is an abolitionist couple. And it's a time when the Haitian Revolution has just begun. If you've been following the dates that I've provided for you, it's a time when the French Revolution had begun. And it's a time when revolution and anti-capitalism was in the dreams of workers on the dock, workers who are about to be thrown into factories in England. And this is the story that is told in this book, Red Round Globe Hot Burning. And the importance of this book is it teaches us the origins of the Anthropocene, the new geological epoch that we're faced with on the planet now, where plastic is ruining the fish of the Pacific, where global warming is raising the waters, where species are being extinguished. This is a new epoch, not just in history, but in geology, geological history. So the geologists are considering. Red, round, globe, hot burning requires not only a change of the planet, but a change of the heart. The story is a tale at the crossroads, which we know the crossroads is a place of danger, but also of opportunity, between the commons and closure, between race and class, between love and terror. Because what happened to Edward Marcus Despard in his effort against the crown for Irish independence, for the abolition of slavery, is that they hanged him and beheaded him, along with 7 other conspirators. They picked him up in November 1802. By the way, I just learned after doing this book, in November 1802, John Dalton gave a speech at the Manchester Philosophical Society in which he proposed 5 atoms. Atomic theory was being developed precisely at that moment. That's just coincidence. But what's not coincidence is a new view towards the earth and towards science was being biology, chemistry, astronomy, all being changed at this moment. It's a deep moment of what we call counter-revolution. They put him in jail. There was a massive prison building program, 45 new prisons built in the 1790s, just at the time, and in the French Revolution, and in Haiti, the prisons are opening up. Not so in England. New prisons. The working class calls them the Bastille. He's thrown into one. She immediately starts organizing the wives of other political prisoners. Her name is Catherine. She is a force in London. She goes up to Horatio Nelson. You've seen Trafalgar Square, haven't you? You've seen that big plinth right in the middle on the top is this Admiral Nelson. She goes up to him and says, "You don't treat prisoners this way." Who is this woman? She goes to the Home Secretary of the British Empire, the Duke of Portland, and does the same. To William Wickham, the head of the Secret Service of England, the spying agencies, the CIA at the time, she does the same. You don't treat my husband or the other political prisoners this way. In Parliament, she spoke to Parliament, the center of landlords. Her name is Catherine Despard. So they're going to do him in, hang him, take his head off, open him up, take his intestines out while he's alive, burn them in front of his own eyes, and then cut off each of his limbs and paste them in different cities in London as an example to others. I call this thanatocracy. That means the rule by death. And this is what she said. No, she wouldn't accept this. She went to prison the night before he was to suffer and helped him compose his speech from the gallows. Incredible. She's the Angela Davis of her time. She's the Ruthie Gilmore of her time. This woman is fighting against the thanatocracy, the government by death. That's why we need to remember her. This is why she is important to us. Because those structures that I mentioned, slavery, the plantation, the factory, and I didn't talk about the ship, humanity did not have to go that route. Humanity could go a route such that Rodney proposed, of custom, of learning, of generosity, of subsistence for all. That's the point of red round globe hot burning. How much time have I got?
About 5 or 10 more minutes, and I do want to ask you, amongst other things, to go back to the first time we saw Rodney in Rockport, and also the radical humanism, among other threads.
Okay, you can ask that during the question time.
Okay, that's fair. That's fair.
But right now, I have my shtick, and I want to finish it. But certainly it's important, and I don't need to.
At least 10 more minutes.
But no, it's going to be shorter than that because I'm very anxious to hear the other speakers and to hear all of you. I feel I've had my chance to. I went looking for her grave because after he was murdered, or after he was launched into eternity, she went to Ireland. And the Irish comrades looked after her. So I went to Ireland looking for her grave. And what I found there, I'm not going to tell you, but it's in my book. It's Red, Round, Globe, Hot Burning. It's good. It's good. Yeah, in more So I'm trying to say 1800 to 1804, this is an important historical conjuncture. And you'll notice not once have I used the term industrial revolution. This is a false term and will lead you down a tricky path. It's a conjuncture of economic forces, of human forces, of cultural forces. New political entities are formed, including the UK and the USA. Both of these political entities had their formation at that time for the purpose of privatization and enclosure. That's the purpose of those two political entities. Let there be no mistake about it. And the reason I say that and insist on it is that if there is an evil whose beginning we know, it's easier to contemplate its end. And if we wish, if we can mount to the boldness of Walter Rodney's thought and the boldness of the people of Jamaica, the Caribbean, of Africa, who produced and encouraged Walter Rodney, then perhaps we too, in our time, can ascend to that boldness of spirit. Use our imagination to imagine another world and then to fight for it. This, I think, is not only the general lesson of history, it's the particular lesson of Ned and Kate, of Colonel Edward Marcus Despard and Catherine Despard. It's not so much that I want to see a stamp with their name on it or a coin with their profile on it, as I want to see what they fought for being part of what we fight for. That's it. So conjuncture, that's one concept. The other concept that if I was with Rodney, we could engage is a criticism of what is the working class. And at that conjuncture time, it was slavery, artisans, sailors, and servants. That was it. So that's where, how could those people, how were they divided? How were they prevented from forming that global force that could prevent the imperial enterprise of UK and USA capitalism? That, I think, is what Red Round Globe's Hot Burning raises. The title comes from a poem by William Blake. Who's heard of William Blake? Would you please raise your hand? All of you get William Blake's poems. The songs of innocence and experience you will have for the rest of your life are short, they're beautiful, they're easy to understand. Do you ever fall in love? Do you ever meet people who you really love? Get one of these poems and give it to them, and you will succeed. Because it's beauty that keeps us together. They told me that night and day was all that I could see. They told me that I had 5 senses to enclose me up, and they enclosed me up, enclosed my infinite brain into a narrow circle, and sunk my heart into the abyss, a red round globe, hot burning, till all from life I was obliterated and erased. Wow, there's Blake writing a fantastic poem that is an allegory of the Haitian revolt. Visions of the daughters of that. I'm done. Can I have a little applause?
today, but man, what a riveting lecture. You all are really lucky to be here and to be a part of it. Historic lecture is part of our series, a gift. Really, we've run out of chairs, which is amazing. Maybe some of my students can pull a few more in. Maybe volunteer yourself and get 2 or 3. Appreciate that. That's good. Two of you all can handle that. Thank you. And Peter, please have a seat. We'll get you a spot. You'll take a Jamu spot because I'm bringing a Jamu up. Let's not take any time. Dr. Jamu Nagwaya is a new comrade and friend of mine. I'm very excited to be in the same place as him. We've been working together a little bit more and more over the past few months. He's a very important person. I'm really glad to share this community with him and to share him with this community. He's very Rodney-esque, and I don't say that lightly, in the sense of being an activist and a scholar, and not one or the other, but both, really in combination. He is a labor activist, a labor union leader. We have some points of connection. We both have Toronto and Ontario, Canadian element. He's coming to us now from Mona, Jamaica, where Walter Rodney went to school and where he grounded with his brethren and ended up getting kicked out by the government just for spreading too much knowledge and information. An amazing thing. And that book, Grounding to My Brother's Results, and Dr. Nagwaya will talk about that. He also has years of experience working here in the U.S. South as an activist, and he's very much an activist and a scholar and an exemplar of how to mix those two things together. He's written engaged articles. He's one of the only people I know writing about police brutality in Canada, which a lot of people mistake as utopia. It's great, but it's not perfect. And so that's one of the places I first saw his writing. In Pambazuka, I saw his writing as well. He's written articles about Walter Rodney and how his work relates to current political struggles. He's written about the Grenada Revolution. He writes about key issues that we're dealing with now. And let me just stop there and bring Dr. Nagwaya up, and then we'll have a discussion about these two incredible thinkers and lecturers. So thank you for coming. Yeah.
Comrade Jesse, thanks for the very warm, comradely introduction. At one point, I was wondering if you're talking about me, but you mentioned my name. Comrades, sisters and brothers, I'm glad to be here to speak on Walter Rodney, and particularly to look at what Walter would have to say to Rastafari in the 21st century. Because when we think of Rodney in Jamaica, he worked with urban youth that we would see as lumpen, working class people, but he's mostly known for the work with Rastas, and Rastas remember Rodney. But I believe that Rodney would have a message and a continuation of the type of work he was doing among Rastas. And what's also important is not just Rodney speaking to Rastas 50 years later from the grave. I guess you guys will think this is some kind of spooky thing that a man who has been martyred is going to speak to living people today. But it's not so spooky for us as Africans, where we see the world of the living and the world of the dead as inseparable. They're not separate realms. And if you look at African Caribbean religions such as Voodoo or Revivalism in Jamaica, or Maoism or Santeria, you will see that there's a strict separation. So a lot of times we may even talk about the dead as if they're present. You're not talking about what's like, talking about as if the person is. So I'll be sharing what I believe would be a line of thinking or intervention that Rodney would make to Rastafari in the 21st century. So I'm going to read part of this, and when I look at the elements of Ita Liberty, then I will speak directly to you and not do the prepared speech. Rodney's message to Rastafari and urban youth just over 50 years ago was one that was centered on the belief that the oppressed had the keys in their hands to unlock the doors of oppression, and this role as the architect of history would not be the product of divine intervention for mass departure from the land in which they were located. As a member of the African Revolutionary Petty Bourgeoisie, and a lot of times when we call someone petty bourgeois, people get upset and look at it as an insult. But Rodney, when he talks about the petty bourgeois, he looks at this as an analytical concept, because there will be no successful revolution in the 21st century or since the French Revolution without the revolutionary petty bourgeois elements serving as a catalyst. Lenin, Trotsky, Rodney, Malcolm, Sister Baker here in, I always forget her name. She's Ella Baker, yeah. I love her so much, but I always seem to, the revolution in the modern period is the realm of the revolutionary petty bourgeois. These are elements who could integrate themselves into the capitalist order and live decent lives. But they decide to commit class suicide as advocated by Amilcar Cabral. And that's another revolutionary that you should know about. If you don't know anything about Amilcar Cabral, you should go home and read about Amilcar Cabral, one of the greatest revolutionaries of the 21st century. But today we don't know much about him. In the 60s and 70s, he had the same stature as Ho Chi Minh and Fidel Castro. When he went to the first Tricontinental Conference, he gave the opening speech, and this was a gathering of revolutionaries from Latin America, Asia, all over the world. But he gave the opening presentation and the longest presentation, and Castro spoke glowingly about his contribution. So check him out. But the revolutionary petty bourgeois, like Walter Rodney, have committed Cabral's class suicide and made themselves one with the laboring class, the suffering people. And we need more of that. So when we talk about petty bourgeois, it's not a put down, even though there are moments, even myself, I'll say, that's petty bourgeois self-indulgence. But generally, I use it as an analytical term. So Rodney, as a member of the revolutionary petty bourgeois in the academy, knew that one of the chief functions of himself and people like him was to attach himself to the activity of the masses. A fundamental thing. By immersing himself in the ranks of the masses, especially the Jamaican Rastas, he placed himself in a position to help these anti-colonial actors see the struggle of the people for change would happen. Campbell, in his book, and quote me, had understood his message to the point that they themselves began to question the emphasis on repatriation and Haile Selassie. And those are fundamental things, because Selassie and repatriation are central principles of Rastafari. That today, when we talk about the, defining principles of Rastafari, the divinity of Haile Selassie and repatriation to Africa are two critical things. Those of us who take a materialist view of the world will see that as idealism, that you're looking outside of yourself for emancipation when human freedom will come through what we do. It's not outside of us where you will expect somebody is going to come and bring you to a Zion or some liberated place. It's work that we do. And Rodney was very, very, very much conscious of the importance of that. And and the more progressive were calling for people's government in Jamaica and Ethiopia. That's the influence of Rodney, because people, some Rastas, and it still happens today, there's a mansion in the Blue Mountains called School of Vision. They have an idea of repatriation, but it will be a judgment when chariots of fire, as mentioned in Isaiah, will take them to Zion. So they are not going to self-repatriate to Africa, because they would be committing a sin. Because only when judgment come and the world is destroyed and the righteous shall go back to Zion, that's when they will go. And some Rastas also have the belief that repatriation will come through divine intervention. You don't need to do that. So for some Rastas to be questioning repatriation, questioning the focus on Selassie, that was a significant development. And I would say, and that's also probably the reason why they had to get rid of Rodney, because people would be looking at how to run away from Jamaica, but instead how to work to emancipate Jamaica. The year 1968 was one that witnessed a dramatic upsurge in popular struggles across the globe, especially on the part of students and other young people. This progressive political context of rising people's struggles and advances certainly assisted Rodney's attempt to influence Rastafari and other under-colonial elements, students, faculty, working class, towards a materialist understanding of the economic, social, political, and cultural bondage that define their lives. In the public education organ called Black Man Speaks, and that was a journal, a newspaper put out by progressive Black power forces in Jamaica. Rupert Lewis gives us an idea of the materialist orientation of Rodney's intervention in the ideational or ideological direction of this publication. And I'm quoting Rupert Lewis, and he has written on Rodney as a political biography out on Rodney. Black Man Speaks had a strong Selassie orientation mixed with left-wing ideas and Black nationalist views. Rodney and some of the youth tried to make the line of the paper more radical by saying it should not provide only Rastafarian views. He tried to infuse Black nationalism with social and class analysis and an understanding of power relations within the world and 20th century imperialism. When we talk about political struggle, a lot of times we leave out imperialism because it's almost as if we're implicating ourselves. In this culture that we're currently located, sitting and reasoning, it's an imperialist order. But it's almost as if when we don't talk about imperialism anymore. You know what term that we use? Globalization. Euphemism. And also, generally, even when we attack capitalism, we don't really attack capitalism. We talk about corporate capitalism, crony capitalism, as if it's an acceptable form of capitalism. It's just those crony capitalism that's really bad. But no form of capitalism, mercantilism or mercantile capitalism, all of them screw the working class in public and private. So when we critique capitalism, we don't say capitalism, not neoliberal capitalism. We may use that to talk about the expression of capitalism since 1974 or since Thatcherism and Reaganomics. But we only do that as an analytical thing and to just kind of root it in an historical moment. But we are against capitalism as much as we're against imperialism. And that is something that when we read Rodney today, you can't leave, especially when it engages ideas on how the world imperialist system works. We know imperialism is a bad thing. And all of us must be committed, to work for its destruction in order for us to liberate other people. And your duty here, in the sense of imperialism, is to destroy it from within. We don't want you to come to the Caribbean and go to Africa and help us in our struggle. Fight our common enemy right here, because it's the same enemy we're fighting over there, because they're in cahoots with our local elites. And an article that's worth reading from Rodney it came out in Black Scholar in 1974 as contemporary trends in the English-speaking Caribbean. That today at Mona or throughout the Caribbean, our scholars like to talk about post-colonialism. And the thing is that, I was away from Caribbean for 30 years in North America. So I think, they're talking about this post-colonialism, and I'm saying, what? I was going to cuss that. I was wondering what the hell is going on in the Caribbean. Because in order for us to experience post-colonialism, colonialism must have ended. It is neo-colonialism, and that's the term, the category that Rodney used. When we say post-colonialism, we do not implicate the local rulers in capitalist exploitation and the work they're doing with imperialism. But every time we say neo-colonialism, it reminds us that it's colonialism in a new form. Instead of direct colonialism, now we have the local native elites that are ruling with their friends in the metropolitan countries. So we should throw that post-colonialism out. And if we have control over journals that include post-colonialism in their name, we should keep a name change. Name change is a good thing. So Rodney, remind us of the work we must do against imperialism, and he tried to infuse that in the publications Black Man Speaks. This political stance conditioned many Rastas to limit the external idealist gaze of forces outside of themselves be the principal agents of a fundamental restructuring or elimination of the Babylonian system. Because if we're saying that the race dynamics and class dynamics are things that we should focus on and through our work destroy them and create a new society, we're not looking externally for anybody to do anything for us. And that's something that Hearst Campbell also talked about in the Caribbean, is that at times we displace the Europeans, with Western imperialism to help us, and we were focused on the Soviet Union as a new lord that was just gonna save us, instead of looking at our local condition and said, how can we build 21st and socialism in the Caribbean context? We essentially exchange one master for another, ideationally and otherwise. An integrated class race analysis would have allowed some of them, through Rodney's intervention, to see the distinct character of capitalism as a system of oppression that intersects and works hand in glove with capitalism to downpress. This is a term that Rastafari use, because they're saying there's nothing oppressive or upful about oppression. And for Rastas, word should mean, if you use downpress, it means that they're holding it down, but they pronounce oppress in the Jamaican language, that's up. There's nothing up, full and positive and righteous about oppression. So when you hear Bob Marley talk about this wicked down oppression, that's what they're talking about, the oppressive system. So it would allow them to see the distinct character of capitalism as a system of oppression that intersects and works hand in glove with capitalism to downpress African masses in Jamaica and elsewhere. It should be noted that after the April 1966 state-sponsored visit of Haile Selassie to Jamaica, a narrative emerged of His Imperial Majesty instructing Rastafari in Jamaica to prioritize liberation before repatriation, or some people say centralize and organize. I think that's very significant because this happened prior to Rodney coming there. So, and that, the notion of liberation before repatriation is a materialist way of seeing the struggle, or to organize and centralize, because but the significance of this message is that Rastafari should preoccupy themselves with the work of dramatically improving the material conditions of themselves and the laboring classes by pulling together their forces organizationally and organize for social change with the masses. Because if it's liberation before repatriation, means we have to do the work, the freedom work. Rastas are not going to isolate themselves from the struggle and engage in Babylon. And it was also a period that people like Sam Brown was running for elected office, and again, Rastafari fireball politics, because they said they're not dealing with politics, that's really politics. And they're correct. Liberal capitalist democracy is a trick imposed on the people to feel that we're electing our masters and we can direct them every 4 or 5 years. But we do not have control, substantive control over them. If we did, we would have free university education, we would have housing would be free, we would not purchase food, and that's against the part of Rastafari vision that food shouldn't be commodified. How the hell are you going to buy and sell food? And we need food. It's like healthcare. But the capitalists, you have to buy and sell healthcare or housing. Why should we have to buy housing? If we as a working class had the power, those things would be a reality. We'd have a living wage. Not only would we have a living wage, we would self-manage our workplace. They become democratic spaces. So we really do not have power, but ideological conditioning of the capitalists has led us to believe that we have a stake in this system, when our objective should be to tear it down, to burn it down, to destroy. And when we destroy, we construct a new system, a new society, the New Jerusalem. These are the things that we must not be afraid to speak about, because what the enemy wants us is not to give the type of speech that may incite and inspire and motivate people to look for a different and to work for a different society. If we're afraid to say in public the things that people need to hear, how will the people who are not aware become conscious? If we say that we are prophetic, Do you think the prophets, Old Testament prophets, were well-liked people? No, not even the sufferers like them. Because they're the type of people who are going to say what you need to hear. They're not sugarcoated. And Rodney was like that. I'm going to tell you what you need to hear, not what you want to hear. And this is how we have to behave in the 21st century. So this centralized and organized message still resonates with many Rastafari at a rhetorical level in the Caribbean and elsewhere Rastafari exists, or as a metaphor, as something we believe in, but we're not actually putting things in practice to make it a reality. There's not much in the way of joining or forming secular organizations and working to free the people in Rastafari. There's some level of organizing going on, but not the type that's going to disrupt the state. If anything, the state will probably try to bring Rastafari into the fold because you can use them to sell tourism product, and you can use them to talk to earn money from the cultural and creative industries, because the people are not raising fundamental questions that would make Babylon quiver and shake. The message is very palatable today in terms of even Rastas who are involved in consciousness raising through their work. It is the preceding weakness of Rastafari, not organ people. It's this preceding weakness of Rastafari as idealists or non-intervention in the material struggles of people that inspire Lichin Samaj, was a Rastafari, to declare that Rastafari as a religion can be, and this word, can be a potential support system for social change. He went on to comment further in a very pointed way, and this is Samaj speaking. It is my position that we need to examine the positive dimensions of the religion which have evolved out of Rastafari and build on these positives towards creating a social theory. And some people firebomb theory and say, oh, theory does theory argument. But as Cabral said, we have yet to see a successful revolution that's not based on a theory. The best theory is as a practice, but we must develop ideas about what it is that we want. Ideas that explain the oppressive condition, ideas describe it, and also we prescribe what are the things we do to effect revolution and emancipation. So the reason for this, according to Samaj, is that religion and mythology can only move us but so far. We need to consciously define, amplify, and propagate principles and concepts which determine our relationship to each other and to the world. This, by definition, is a social theory. In the view of Samaj. Samaj wrote the above words as a member of Rastafari, and Rodney would certainly have endorsed his emphasis on human agency, purposive action, and organizational structures as key elements of a collective consciousness and practice of liberation. Samaj's correct understanding of the limitation of mythology, religion and mythology in the emancipatory struggle of the Dawn Press would have warmed the humanistic heart of Brother Wally. That was a term that Rastas called Wally. It wasn't Dr. Rodney. It was just Brother Wally. It's at a level of, it's almost, well, I guess everything of the context of the Caribbean where people are very title conscious. When I went down there in 2006, I've never been called Dr. Nangwea so much. When I was in Canada, it was jamming, even with your colleagues. Down in the Caribbean, like they're using that. And it's so serious that if you're a professor, not just merely a lecturer, but you're a professor,